Trust is a relationship that occurs when one individual can depend upon another individual. And empathy is very often the first step in that. You understanding that other person, and out of that understanding, having a sense of how can I help this other person achieve certain goals or certain opportunities that will make their life better. And then those two develop a trusted relationship where one is helping the other.
Welcome to Season 16 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Thanks so much for watching or listening. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy, the last episode of 2024. And today I am joined by none other than the Right Honorable David Johnston, who served as Canada's 28th Governor General. During his tenure, he founded the Rideau Hall Foundation to inspire, honor, and connect Canadians. And prior to that, he was a professor of law for 45 years, held pivotal leadership roles within the academy, including principal of McGill University and president of the University of Waterloo. He was also the first non-U.S. citizen to be elected chair at Harvard University's Board of Overseers, from which he graduated in 1963 magna cum laude and was twice named All-American in hockey and named to Harvard's Athletic Hall of Fame. Mr. Johnston has been recognized for his lifetime of contributions and service with more than 35 honorary degrees and is a companion of the Order of Canada. He's a prolific author of 30 books, including this gem, Empathy Turning Compassion into Action, which I will now put right next to my book because I think it's in good company. And finally, in addition to his professional accomplishments, he's the proud father to 5 daughters and grandfather to 14. So welcome so much to the show, Mr. Johnston.
Oh, call me David, Anita. And the great part of that introduction was the very last. My wife, Sharon, the 5 daughters and the 14 grandchildren, who, by the way, call me Grandpa Book. I'm looking at your book because they associate me with reading books to them.
Love it. I'm in the process of reading some Nancy Drew to my daughter. So
Lovely, lovely.
Now, Supreme Court Justice Rosalie Abella wrote the foreword of your book, and she was very generous with this opening sentence that reads, "Empathy is not simply the title of David Johnston's book, it is the title of David Johnston's life." And her closing words are, "Empathy is our best hope for the future." This book shows us how to turn that hope into reality because David Johnston's whole life is a tribute to the triumph of wisdom, compassion, and justice. In other words, the triumph of empathy. I'd love to hear what empathy means to you and why you hold it as a value so dear.
Well, the first thing I should say, Anita, is how humbled I was when I saw what Rosalie had written. And in fact, I thought that you've got it all wrong, Rosie. This doesn't describe me, it describes you. And if anything, you've put me up with the imposter syndrome. She is a remarkable retired justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. She will be known as one of the most distinguished people that have ever occupied the position of Supreme Court Justice, and we've had many outstanding people. What's unique about Rosie, I think, is she really does live empathy and wisdom out of empathy. She was early on chair of the Ontario Labour Relations Board, and at that time was tasked to chair a single-person task force on equality of opportunity, particularly with gender issues. And out of her work came the notion of equal pay for equal work. And from there, she has just been such a strong advocate of human dignity and human rights and empathy in action. So I was just deeply honored that Rosie would do that. I know for a long time. She was a student when I was a young law professor at the University of Toronto, so we go back a very long way. What does empathy mean to me? It really comes from that original notion of the golden rule, love thy neighbor. And it's being able to walk in the other person's shoes. And I say empathy is a verb, not just a noun, which the verb is roll up your sleeves. Empathy is more than compassion, as you point out so well in your book. Compassion is feeling the hurt of other people or their disadvantage. empathy is doing something about it. And it's that notion of purposeful empathy, empathy in action, that is very meaningful to me. Why is it important? Well, I link it with trust, and I think empathy and trust go hand in hand. Um, Empathy and trust are two sides of the same coin, and hope is what's in between them in that coin. Trust is a relationship that occurs when one individual can depend upon another individual. And empathy is very often the first step in that. You understanding that other person, and out of that understanding, having a sense of how can I help this other person achieve certain goals or certain opportunities that will make their life better. And then those two develop a trusted relationship where one is helping the other. I
They,
should just expand on that trust, and then we'll move on. Trust is the grease and the glue that holds a society together, the glue that keeps it cohesive, not warring with one another, but helping one another, and the grease in the sense that it makes interaction so much easier. If you have a transactional relationship with some other person, you probably have to bring in a lawyer like me to write up a 50-page document setting out your rights and responsibilities. On the other hand, if you have a trusted relationship, it's a handshake, and that does it. And the final story on the relationship of empathy and trust comes from George Shultz, who died a year or so ago at age 99. He was Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Labor in US governments. He was chief of staff to two different presidents, one Republican, one Democratic. And imagine that today, same person serving both administrations. And shortly before he died, he spoke about trust, saying trust is the coin of the realm. Where you have trust in the room, whether it's the boardroom, the operating room, the training room, the family room, everything goes well. And when you don't, it doesn't. Everything else is detail. And empathy and trust, hand in hand, are really key to a healthy society.
yeah, and I certainly think having trust in institutions and in the government is fraying in today's world. I just came back from Singapore and I was talking to I did my master's degree at NTU, and one of my former classmates was saying that Singaporeans have a high level of trust in their government, 70% trust their government. And I think it's a very risky future if we don't trust public servants and elected officials. So thank you for making that strong connection. I know in your book you write that you believe empathy, and I'm quoting here, is the deliberate movement from compassion to action. Um, the action piece is really important to you, but I wonder if you could describe ways that you think it manifests, because I mean, I think public policy is one of the ways it manifests. I wonder if you could share your ideas about how could we turn this compassion that we feel for others into legitimate action.
Well, my wife says service is love made real. So the notion of public service, I think, is quite keen. And each act of kindness leading to empathy and action, improving the lot of other people, has a ripple effect. The Queen Elizabeth in her Christmas messages would always refer to a parable from the New Testament, and the one she would use most frequently is the Good Samaritan story of a person who was from a rival tribe 2,000 years ago in Israel, was fell upon by thieves and left for death in a ditch. And shortly thereafter, individually, two of the renowned and respected elders in the Israeli religious group saw the individual and just walked on by. And it was only a little later that a Samaritan from a rival hostile tribe came by and aided the person, bound up his wounds, took him to him, and kept him. But that was the love thy neighbor principle of recognizing the neighbor is not simply your kin or someone with whom you have a close relationship and therefore would be inclined to help, but someone who is not your kin but needs help. And out of that manifestation of empathy comes an enormous bridging of the gap between different factions and so on. And I think in our politics, we need to find better ways of exercising civility and respect to one another. And out of that, coming to to see that developing kind of concentric circles of influence are important. Just to come to government, Anita, one of the most interesting tasks I did was I was asked to chair the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy back in the early 1980s when the United Nations Declaration on Sustainable Development emerged with Gro Harlem Brundtland, who'd been the Prime Minister of Norway, chairing that. And Mr. Mulroney, who was very given to sustainable development environment, actually set up a round table of experts from different spheres to develop the notion of sustainable development for Canada, asked me to chair it. We had four ministers of the Crown, including Minister of Finance, Mike Wilson, four CEOs of industry, people who were in the areas of industry with chemicals, among other things, four people from kind of public policy background like myself, and then four people who were environmentalists. And it took a meeting or two, the round table, for us to establish a trust relationship. And at one point, Harvey Andre, who was Minister of Industry from Calgary, at the second meeting, and he said to the four environmentalists, look, he said, you've already been broadcasting what we're discussing, etc. I cannot participate in any further in disclosing the confidential link to aid in what we're doing if you're going to broadcasting them. So you have to decide whether you want to be Lech Walesa or Cardinal Richelieu. Walesa was then leading the Polish Solidarity movement and blasting the government. And Cardinal Richelieu was the power behind the throne of Louis XIV and other French kings of getting things done by bringing interests together. And our environmentalists retired for a little bit. And they came back and said, let's try Louis XIV. And out of that developed a trust relationship where each of the different interest groups would put on the table both their concerns, their solutions, etc. It was like concentric circles with this person's circle of interest, this person's, and bringing them together, and found where they became concentric, found where you could find common ground. But it began with the notion of finding common ground, because Harvey Andre says, look, we'll come to these meetings because the Prime Minister says we have to. But if we can't discuss things frankly and in confidence with you, we won't get anywhere. And we got a long ways. I think the Ford meeting, we came up with a definition of sustainable development, which then went into as a litmus test for bills through Parliament as to whether they met sustainable development goals. So that's just one example of building trust around a really important issue, which is climate change, by finding the concentric circles. And it comes from empathy and trust in one another.
Thank you for sharing that story. You also write in your book that the predominant human response to the hardship and suffering of others is the desire to help. Now, I completely agree, but the dominant cultural narrative is in opposition to that. And what can we do about that?
Well, I think each of us lights a lamp against the darkness in our own way, and we should not be overcome by the darkness that exists. I've learned empathy from my family, Anita. I grew up in a very modest background in a Northern Ontario town, and playing hockey in the National Hockey League was the most important thing to me. And I went to work at age 8 because if I wanted a new pair of blue jeans or a bicycle, you go and earn the money for it. So I was a kind of a rugged individualist, I guess, very self-reliant and kind of proud about, so my life isn't adored with richness, but I can make it on my own. It was Sharon, my wife, I was her first date in high school. I'm 13, and I began to learn empathy from her. And then as our 5 children came into the world, I learned it from my 5 children. And their father is a very different man than he was as an 8-year-old. So I think you learn empathy from others. And I think just bringing this to the family, we try to teach it to our children. Our 5 daughters began international exchanges at about age 12, and they came from a comfortable family, but they were exposed through their church and through their volunteer activities to hardship and others. And in their international exchanges, they very often were exposed to difficult situations. One was in Hong Kong at university there, and spent some time in the refugee camp and so on. And I watched four things happen to my children through these exposures to different and difficult circumstances. One, they became more curious. There's a natural curiosity in children, but it was a more uh, pinpointed why. Secondly, they became more tolerant in different views, in fact, encouraged different views. Their judgment became better. They were always insisting on hearing both sides of the story before they came to a judgment, and it was thought through. But most important of all, they became more empathetic. So, what do we do in a world where empathy is kind of discounted? I think we begin with our own family and then in our own neighborhoods to manifest empathy and realize that the ripple effect is very powerful.
That so completely aligns with the origin story of my interest in empathy because you might not know the backstory, but I was interested in I have a PhD in education, and I was interested in how do we teach the next generation of leaders to become, interested in social impact, in positive social change. And when I interviewed dozens of social entrepreneurs, one of the things that I heard from their origin story of their life is that they had service modeled in their homes and they had families with an ethos of giving back. So I fully agree with that. And it plays such an important role. It plays such an important role to have families that model that kind of behavior. At the end of each chapter, you offer suggestions to readers about how they can flex their empathy muscles, and I'd really love for you to elaborate on two of them. So, you wrote and recommend that we listen patiently to the young, say less so you hear more. I love that. Say less so you hear more. And the second one is that you want us to presume the best of people and hold back judgment. Could you speak to those, please?
Yeah, the first thing I would say, Anita, is that the trust book, the one we wrote before empathy, the dedication is to children who offer their trust implicitly in the full expectation of fairness. So, as you describe so well in your book, and you look at the neurology and the psychology of the human brain, then the notion of reaching out to help others is embedded there equally in receiving that help. And it begins with little children who put their trust in others. And it's for us adults to fulfill that. A good example of that, listen patiently to the young, say less and hear more, hold back judgment. Our eldest daughter, Debbie, was 4, and we were in Cambridge, England, where Sharon and I had spent our first year of marriage when I was a student. We're back for a sabbatical 6-month period. And in the little village, Girton, about 5 kilometers outside of Cambridge Center, we had the house that we rented, and we went to the local church, the Anglican church there, which was over 1,000 years old, so a lot of history. And I think it was the third Sunday we were there. The service had started. We were in the middle of the church in a pew, and the back door opened, and in and through the back door came a man who I think was homeless, but dressed like a hobo, very, very disheveled, very poor, and somewhat crippled. And he sat down in the back row as we had seen him in the previous 2 Sundays. And our daughter, a 4-year-old Debbie, had crayons and some sheets of paper that she brought to amuse herself. And about 5 months after he had come into church, she got up out of the pew and started towards the back. And I got up to sort of follow her, but I paused, listened for a change, and just watched her. She went to the back pew and she sat down, and I saw her sit down. And so I came back and sat down. About 10 minutes later, she came back to the pew, and I said, "Dear, you don't have your paper anymore." She says, "No, I left it." I said, "Well, would you like me to get it?" She says, "No, no." She says, "I gave it to my friend, your friend." And I said, "Well, that was nice, but what else?" She said, "Well, I drew a picture of him and of me." And I said, "Why did you do that, dear?" She said, "Because he needs a friend." And this was a 4-year-old. And I've just watched those experiences with my children ever since, seeing how those acts of empathy make a difference. Moving to a little different example, Anita, when I became Governor General in October of 2010, the office was somewhat dysfunctional, and it was kind of a split between those communication experts who were supporting the Governor General and the others who were supporting the institution. I was very anxious to see all of you are here to strengthen this institution. I happen to be here, but I'm a secondary individual. It's the institution that's key. And the second day, my desk was this high with documents to sign. The Governor General signs legislation into law, signs orders in council, signs commissions for ambassadors going abroad or military service officers, etc., responds to a number of letters and documents and so on. And each of the documents I had to sign had a one-page covering memo, and on it were 6 different signatures. And I said, why do we have 6 signatures? Oh, sir, it's very important that we get these things right. So it goes through. So I'm not a guy who cut off heads, but I said, look, we're going to run a little experiment. It's called 1/1 in 1. One is the person who drafts this document, the order in council, etc. The next one is me who signs it. And the third one is 1 day, 24 hours. So heretofore, the first person that drafts the document will take full responsibility for it. The next 5 people will no longer be overseeing that work and grading it good, bad, or indifferent. But on the other hand, they are the coaches, the mentors, the trusted colleagues, who, if you, number one, have any question about this particular document, you go to one or more of them and have their assistance and be sure that that problem is allayed. And the final one is, I say, 24 hours. It won't be possible in every case, but our mantra will be things in, things out in 24 hours. And the first person, then there was some hesitation. Gee, I'm fully responsible. Yes, you are. But you have friends, these other 5 people, and they're not your overseers. They're your trusted confidants, the people you trust with one another. Mistakes will be made, but just be sure that you've got antenna as to where the possible areas are and anticipate them. And if they happen, we repair them, etc. That was one thing that just changed the atmosphere entirely of the whole institution, because these were empathetic actions that people were reaching out to help one another. And they were built on trust relationships. I trust that first person. And I would say, I'm not sure how many documents I will sign in a year. It turns out about 50,000, which is a lot. I said, I will not be able to read every one. I'll scan them and sign them. So I'm dependent upon you. And you want to be sure that you have taken steps to be sure that it's subject and appropriate for signing. That was transformative. And those were all about empathy and trust relationships, trusting in your people. And the notion of pride in that office of doing things well and turning them around quickly became great. And within 5 years, it became the employer of choice for all government agencies because of the trust factor.
That's an excellent anecdote, because we can be empathic in all facets of our lives, whether it is at work, whether it's in family, whether it's in community, whether it's at the level of public policy. And I can't believe we're at the last question of this conversation, but thank you so much for spending part of your day with me. I always ask my guests at the end of these conversations to think of a time in their life when they were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for them. So I wonder if anything comes to mind, Mr. Johnston.
Well, call me David, Anita. A zillion things come to mind. In fact, when I gave my installation address as Governor General in the Senate chambers here in Ottawa, I said, this is about a smart and caring nation and the public good. But if you remember only 3 words of what I say today, they are cherish our teachers, because apart from our family, they are often the ones who have the most impact on us. And if we had 3 or 4 hours together in this chamber, I'd tell you dozens of stories of people who have affected my life through their empathy and reaching out and helping a young guy succeed a little more. One story that I often tell is, I think I was 13 or 14 at this time, and hockey was a very big thing for me. And there was one indoor arena in Sault Ste. Marie where I grew up. And on Friday nights, our 14-year-old under team, 15 and under team would play. And we learned that a scout from the Toronto Maple Leafs was going to be there that evening. It was a Friday night. I got a call on a Thursday from a man by the name of Dan Taylor, who ran a sporting goods shop across the street from the arena. I didn't know him. I knew of him. But I had never purchased a piece of equipment from his store. I never had a new piece of equipment. My gloves, my shin pads, everything else were hand-me-downs, and I was glad to have them. And he phoned and said, will you come into my store an hour before your game tomorrow night? I've got something for you. I said, yes, Mr. Taylor, I will. Went in the store, to make a long story short, he had a brand new pair of skates for me. It's the first time I'd ever had any new equipment. And I put those skates on and I scored 3 goals that night. I was like Hans Brinker with the golden silver skates. I don't think the skates ever touched the ice. But this was a guy who didn't know me, but knew a kid kind of struggling, etc. And that was enormously thoughtful. And I think of Dan Taylor and so many other Dan Taylors in my life that have made a difference. We did 5 books, as I mentioned, when I was Governor General, on fundamental Canadian values. Anita, trust being the second last and empathy being the last one. The one that we're working on now answers your question, I think, a little bit about what empathy means to me. The working title of that book is Civility, Service, and the Public Good, celebrating our heroes. And it will take the different features of the honor system in the Office of the Governor General, Order of Canada, people whose motto is they desire a better country, Sovereign's Medal on Volunteerism, and so on, and explain why we honor people that have shown positive empathy, build trust, relationships, etc., and celebrate them, because it's important, I think, that especially young people, but all Canadians should know who these heroes are who practice these values every day and make life better for all of us.
Well, I have just spent 30 minutes with one of those Canadian heroes. And since this is coming out just before the holidays, I would encourage everybody who's watching or listening to pick up a copy of Empathy, Turning Compassion into Action. I want to thank you for your time, David, since you've given me permission twice. I also want to thank you again for that story. The reason I love asking that question at the end of these conversations is I never know what to expect, but I watch your face light up telling that story about those new skates, and that you scored 3 goals, and that it's in our power. It's in all our power to turn up the volume of empathy in our lives. There are people who could benefit from just a little extra dose of empathy today and every day. And what a gift it is to pass it on, and the gift it is to feel what it's like when we are empathic with others. So thank you.
Anita, I just want to end by saying how much I admire your work and how important it is. Your book, Purposeful Empathy, as I say, is an encyclopedia, a remarkable range of scholarship, and indicating that there are many ingredients to how we develop empathetic communities and so on. So keep on. It's really important to be the prophet of this important value for all of us. And thank you for having me as your guest.
That means a lot. I wish you and your family, your 5 daughters and 14 grandchildren, a wonderful holiday season. Thank you for everyone who's watching and listening. We'll see you next year at Purposeful Empathy. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Thank you so much for watching or listening to another episode of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Please now consider subscribing or buying a copy of Purposeful Empathy. Thanks again. Have a great day.